여기서라고?
No. So
셋업을 아주 잘했구만.
let's start today's session. So first, we are going to have like a really short review of what we did last time, and then I'm going to tell you about effective ways to do rebuttals. It's not that there's a good way or a bad way, but there's like more effective and like more logically structured ways. So I'm going to be telling you that. And then for today, we're going to do things a little bit different. I'm going to deliver a short PM speech, and then you guys are going to be divided into two people teams, so 3 teams, and then you're going to do a rebuttal against my speech. So first, let's review what we talked about last time. We talked about how we need to make like logically good cases, and we also talked about how to make them. So when we were talking about government case, the first one was solution, right? Solutions, definitions, and like and problem analysis. So these are like why we need this motion in the first place. And then what we talked about was justification. Do you all remember? So in the justification arguments, it was mostly about what is the problem and why our value is important. So in a when we're debating on banning something, we always need to regulate someone's rights. Someone needs to get regulated. Then we have to tell the judge why regulating this person's right is more important than this person's freedom, right? And then we went into effectiveness. So this is basically why we need to do this, and this is why ours will be good. So in the effectiveness, we talked about what are the benefits going to be, and I also told you if you do not have if you cannot think of any good effectiveness arguments, think about the relevant actors in this debate. For example, if this is this house would, if the debating motion is related to education, then the related actors could be students, obviously, schools, and teachers, and parents. So think about how these individuals might be affected, and then you might start to think of more effectiveness and benefits arguments. And then I think that's it. And then we also did some example speeches, right? So today we're going to be talking about rebuttals, and I think rebuttals in general aren't something that we really should fear about, because it's basically like conversations and dialogues. The difference between an ordinary dialogue that you would have between your friends. Oh. 그럼 안 되는데. Thanks. A dialogue between your friends and a rebuttal would be that in a rebuttal you try to disprove each other. So you try to prove why your opposition is wrong. But in a lot of ways, rebuttals are basically like a dialogue between two people. So it's not really something that you guys should be afraid to do. So when we are rebutting an argument, we first need to know how an argument is going to look like, right? So when you look at every argument, it's going to be like this. First, there's going to be a premise, and then that person will say, because A, it will be B. So let's take an example, for instance. This also banned media reporting on suicide. And then say that this argument is an opposition argument. So you want media reporting on suicide. That's what opposition side will say, right? Then the premise of opposition's argument would be we shouldn't ban media reporting because it allows more discussions to happen about suicide. Let's say this is the premise. Then we can find this structure in the second part. So opposition argument would go like this. Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that we must never ban media reporting on suicide because media reportings on suicide mean more discussions about suicide, and then because we have more discussions, it's more likely that social change is going to happen so that less people will commit suicide. This would be a classical opposition side argument, right? Then let's break this part down into the premise A and B. This would be the premise about how media reportings on suicide lead to discussions. If there's news about people dying and people committing suicide, then it's quite obvious that it's going to have more discussions about suicide, right? It's quite obvious that people are going to talk more about those issues. Then, let's see the second part. Because there is more discourse, social change is going to happen. Then, more discourse is going to be A, which is here. And then, social change happening is going to be B, which is here. So do you see how all arguments can be fragmented down into these three parts? Everyone understand? Then, when you're trying to rebut this, there's like no really good point rebutting the premise itself, because the premise is what most people agree upon. It's what people think that's right. Then let's attack the points, let's attack the logical joints between A and B and the premise. First response, and before we go on to this, most of you guys have only one rebuttal to one point. You don't have to do that. It's better to have lots of rebuttals against a single point, because that means it's harder for your opponents to engage upon it, and also it's more convincing for your judge. So if you have like 3 rebuttals against one point, even though the judge doesn't buy one of them, you still have room to persuade the judge, because you have 2 rebuttals left, right? So it's better to have more rebuttals to a single point rather to have like a single line response. A lot of the things that happen in like beginning debates with beginners is that it just goes like this. Oh, this happens. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. And then it goes on and on and on. But then, if you do like multiple responses to it, you get a more layered rebuttal, and you have a greater chance of winning that debate. So how are we going to layer this? I think it's maybe threefold. First, you can say that A doesn't happen. And then in the second thing, you can say that even if A happens, A doesn't really lead to B. That's the second response that you can give. And then finally, you can have a comparison between your side and the opposition about how rather on our side we get B. And actually there's a name for this A. We oftentimes call it best case scenario. So the best case scenario is, as the name tells you, is basically like the best thing that can happen in government case or opposition case. So there's a spectrum of these outcomes, right? You might have a really good outcomes and bad outcomes. Best case scenario means this point. And it's better to attack this point, because if you attack the best case scenario and you prove like the best case scenario is bad, then you automatically just prove that all of the other ones are also bad, because these ones are worse than the best case scenario. Do you understand what I'm talking about? So to give you an example of what this 3 things will be like, let's rebut this argument that media reporting equals to more discussions and then social change happens. Let's rebut this according to these 3 points. Okay, so first we might say that so we might first of all say that this, first, it isn't A. This part will equate to stating that media reporting does not really equal to more discourse. But then the second part could be, even if more discourse was to happen, social change is not going to happen. And then you give a reasoning for that. For example, you might say that social change is unlikely to happen because even though the discourse happens, the discourse is going to be a meaningful discourse. Because when people are talking about, because media reporting on suicide is mostly about gruesome pictures of people committing suicide. It's about gruesome pictures, rhetoric that appeals to emotions. Then it's unlikely that you'll have rational discussions and like more like constructive discussions regarding social change. So that could be the second part of it. And then the last part, in the comparison, you can say why rather on your side you get the social changes instead of the other side. So for example, you could say that under our side, when you ban media reporting on suicide, you're more likely to have things like statistics or more concrete and like more accurate information. So when you have those statistics or such like graphs or whatnot, then it's more likely that people resort to rationality and logic rather than resorting to emotions and like emotional rhetoric. So these are the 3 things that you could fragment your rebuttals into. And final thing to say in the rebuttal section is that when you're doing a comparison, what also happens a lot in beginner debaters is that you try to prove that your side is good and then the other side is bad, but you don't really have to do that. I'll use like a diagram to tell you. Let's say that this is neutral And let's say this is good, this is bad. When you want to win a debate, the only thing that you have to prove is that you're better than your opponent. So let's say that so in a beginner's debate, this is what happens. You try to prove that you're on the good side, and then your opponents are on the bad side. But you don't necessarily have to do this, and it's also very hard, because you have to prove two things, that you are on the good side, and the opposition is on the bad side. So don't do this. Rather, what's much more easier is you can also be like this. You can just concede that your side has no benefits, but you can also say that at least we have more benefits than the opposition. And this is easier to prove, because you don't necessarily have to say that you are always having the benefits and opposition is always going to have the harms. So this is why comparisons are important, because it lessens your burden and it allows you to win a debate much more easily. So this is why comparisons are very important. And when you see the motion and you can't think of like immediate benefits on your side, it might also be a very good strategy to take this route, proving that you are at least better than the opposition instead of proving that you are good and the opposition is bad. I think this is it. Oh, perfect. So I think this is it about talking about rebuttals. Do you have any questions or concerns or anything you want me to explain once more? Any questions? No? Okay, then I will announce the motion, and then after having like 10 minutes of prep time, I will deliver my PM speech, and then you guys can do rebuttals against that. First, we have to divide you guys into groups. Do you guys want to do rock, scissors, paper? 오케이, 다 같이. 안 내면 진다. 가위바위보. Is that a 가위 or 가위? Okay, three people. 안 내면 진다. 가위바위보. 안 내면 진다. 가위바위보. 안 내면 진다. 가위바위보. 안 내면 진다. 가위바위보. Okay, then you two people on one team.
스쿼시볼. 괜찮아.
한 명만. 잘하는 사람 한 명.
아 여기서 잘하는 사람 없어.
Is it fine for me to split up the teams? Okay.
밸런스 조정하시죠.
Let's have you two on one team, William and Hanju on one team, and William and I forgot the name. You two on one team.